Good evening. My name is Ted Landsmark. I'm director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern University. And this is the open classroom. This semester, we have entered into a number of dialogues that are designed to enable us to think beyond COVID, to think about the strategies that we might want to put in place as we look forward to what next year will be like. This one has certainly been a challenging one for everyone involved. I remind everyone that tonight's session is being recorded, and we welcome your participation through our question and answer box. And you can also send us comments through our chat box. Next week, which will be our last class for this semester, we will hear from Matthew Teitelbaum, the director of the Museum of Fine Arts, and we'll be talking about how cultural institutions are adapting to COVID and how they're planning forward to address many of the issues that have been raised by Black Lives Matter. But tonight we are extremely fortunate to have with us the director of Northeastern's Criminal Justice Program. She's been with the university for a number of years, but she's taken over as director just this past summer in the midst of a period of change and turmoil. Not so much for Northeastern, but certainly in the world of criminal justice. Just this past week, our legislature here in Massachusetts handed to our governor a set of new criminal justice reforms, which have been debated both openly and behind closed doors for a number of months. Within the city of Boston, there are proposed changes that are being implemented to change the way we not only think about, but in fact act in relation to criminal justice. And there have been, I think, largely because of the kinds of issues that were raised by George Floyd and what happened to him, and the demonstrations that have been put forward by Black Lives Matter. There's been a lot more discussion of criminal justice and of the criminal justice system this year and last year than we've seen in many, many years. And our speaker tonight, Amy Farrell, is a visionary who is looking forward to the kinds of changes that we need to think about and that we can begin to implement. So with that, I remind folks that we ask that you put your questions into our Q&A box. We will get to as many of them as we can this evening. And with that, I turn our stage over to Professor Amy Farrell. Amy, you're on.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, Ted. I'm really pleased to be here tonight. And thanks to the Dukakis Center for sponsoring this series of talks. It's great to have a forum to discuss with a wide audience these important issues. Since becoming the director of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, I've been thinking a lot, as I have throughout my career, about the complex issues of the justice system, questions of legitimacy, and racial equality. This year presents a number of challenges, as you mentioned in the opening, right? There's a crisis of public health that has disproportionately fallen on communities that have faced long-standing structural disadvantage. There is a crisis of the justice system. There are concerns about the legitimacy and purpose of the justice system. And as a leader of a school of criminology and criminal justice, there are really important questions that we in the school, faculty, students, must face about what the justice system should look like, how we as scholars should do work that helps inform reforms of the justice system, and how we educate students that are going to potentially go into fields where they may be working within the justice system or around the justice system. So I'm really excited about this opportunity tonight. I'm going to share my presentation here. All right. So with that, I'm going to spend some time tonight talking about criminal justice in an era of challenge and reform. And hopefully by the end of this conversation, we can have some engagement about what reform looks like and the ways in which this moment may be different than so many that we have faced before. Because as we know, the justice system is maybe in crisis now. I think we could probably legitimately say the justice system is a system in crisis. It is facing a crisis of public legitimacy and has been for a long time in some different ways. And I'll provide a little bit of context for that claim about the justice system being in crisis as we begin this conversation, right? So public confidence in the justice system has decreased substantially in the last 50 years, right? So this isn't something that just happened since George Floyd. This isn't something that happened in the last year. Part of what I think you'll see as a theme throughout this conversation tonight is that we have been in these conversations over and over and over again, and we come to places of stalemate. And I hope what this moment brings us is some initiatives to move beyond where we have been in the past, which has resulted in a lot of ideas, a lot of institutional change, and very little change in practice, oftentimes. And as a scholar of the criminal justice system, I think it's important for us to understand what are the reasons why it is so difficult for justice system institutions to change what they do and how they do it, and what about what they do is in some ways baked into the cake of what justice systems are about, and in what ways can we change that as a society. So just giving us a little bit of a picture, you know, we're very familiar as the public about the crisis of mass incarceration. And I'm going to show a few different statistics here from public opinion polls about how people are understanding the justice system. We've long found that the public generally holds the justice system in fairly high regard, certainly in comparison to many other areas of the government, particularly politicians. However, public trust and confidence in the justice system has been decreasing substantially over time. And some of that is borne out by public concerns about the fact that the justice system may not be effective. So we have had a crisis of mass incarceration in the United States. Most people here tonight are very familiar with the fact that, you know, since the 1970s, the prison population in the United States has increased over 700%, with about 2.3 million people currently incarcerated in US prisons and jails, with one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. And you know, the de-incarceration, justice system reforms, rollback of sentencing guidelines has become what I think we could arguably say is a balance issue, which is that the public generally agrees at this point in time that we should have justice system reform, that there is some agreement across both Republicans and Democrats about the necessity for reforming the ways in which we handle problems through incarceration. For a long time, incarceration was our solution to lots of social problems. We, as criminologists, spend a lot of time studying the ways in which political elites make complex social problems into crime problems because they have ready-made solutions. It's pretty easy to make something a crime, put a sentence on it, and let the justice system go to work. It's very hard to solve in other ways issues of, you know, poverty, inequality, structural disadvantage. So I think the public is at a place right now where we're sort of in agreement about the necessity of de-incarceration, the need to rethink mass incarceration, and concerns about the legitimacy of policing have equally bubbled up at various points in time to the forefront of the public consciousness. And I think we're in a moment now where there was such a dramatic attention to questions of racial inequality and police violence over the summer that has had some staying power that may be different than some initiatives that we've seen in the past. attention to this issue that I hope may be an opportunity for reform. So just as a really clear picture, a number of different sort of polling agencies, think tanks have over time tracked how the public feels about the police. We know that generally the public believes that that the criminal justice system is not fair. It equally provides treatment across all groups, and particularly that that there are huge racial gaps in that, right? So Black Americans are much more likely to believe that the police treat other Black Americans less fairly, both through police contact and also in general contact with the justice system. We also see in the graph that you can see in sort of the lower right-hand corner that confidence in the justice system over time, we see here Gallup's poll that came out over the summer that with their most recent data, if you look back data from the early 1980s until 2020, that we are at some of the lowest levels of public confidence in the police, and that the racial gap in public confidence, which has always existed, which has existed since we started polling people about public confidence in the police, has been persistent, but has grown. And so in 2020, we see that white adults report about 56% of them feel a lot or quite a lot of confidence in the police, and Black Americans about 19%, right? So that gap has gotten bigger over time. We see equally that Black Americans are less likely to believe that the justice system is effective, that they are less likely than whites to think that the police are protecting them from crime, that they use the right amount of force, that they treat groups equally, and that officers are held accountable when there are situations of misconduct. With only 30% of Black Americans believing that officers are in fact held accountable compared to 70% of white Americans. So, you know, those racial gaps are persistent, strong, and growing. And so very troubling when we think about what the justice system means in terms of its legitimacy and its legitimacy across groups. And I think to the question of the justice system being in crisis, the last statistic I would point us to is actually surveys that have been increasingly done with officers and these questions about sort of self-legitimacy, or questions about the ways in which public concerns about the legitimacy of police affect the way the police do their jobs or how they perceive themselves as you know, as they engage with the public. We have started to see some fairly significant impacts there, which is that, you know, in some recent research by the Pew Center, 86% of officers polled in a fairly large poll of officers around the country believe that fatal encounters between police and Black citizens make their job more difficult, right? So when these things happen, when these acts of police violence occur, it is harder for the police to do the things that the police believe are their mandate or their job. So there are significant questions not only about the equity, fairness, legitimacy, and trust, but actually the effectiveness of police to keep communities safe, right? The job of the police is not to make arrests. The job of the police is not hopefully to use coercive social control. The job of the police is to create safety, right? And so the question is the degree to which the police or the justice system do a good job in communities creating feelings of safety, creating situations where people can thrive and live and be healthy and happy, right? When we think about those core democratic notions of liberty, right? The job of the police is to create a situation where individuals can have liberty. They can have the ability to live in a way that they want to, that does not infringe on the rights of other people. And in fact, the police are one of the only groups that we as a people imbue with the power to use coercive social control. They can deprive others of their liberty, right? And when we get into talking about questions of police violence, it's very important to continue to remember that that power that we grant to law enforcement to use coercive social control is a power that we as a people have granted, and that there is accountability for that to the public in terms of the degrees to which communities feel safe and they feel that their liberty is protected. You know, and those are central to our notions of democracy, right? And when we start to look at some of what we see around police violence, we have some real concerns about where we stand as a country relative to other countries, other democratic countries. So just in the sense of actually setting the stage around police violence, I mean, we could talk about the crisis of the justice system in terms of many different places. We started with mass incarceration. We could talk about questions of fair representation. We could talk about questions of, you know, disproportionately harsh sentencing guidelines. We could talk about issues around effectiveness. And so for tonight, I do want to talk a little bit about these questions about violence by the police, because I think that they are on the forefront of the concern of many Americans, and they certainly have animated our conversations about the legitimacy of the justice system throughout the summer and throughout the fall. So just to set the stage, we know, looking at officially reported data from the FBI, that violence by the police is disproportionately felt by Black Americans. Black Americans represent 13% of the population, but 31% of people killed by the police and 39% of people killed by the police when there's no evidence of attacking. And so, you know, what we would sort of consider to be the inappropriate or illegitimate uses of force. And when we look at that question of police violence in context to other countries, we can see here, again, using supplemental homicide data from the FBI, where police violence in the United States fits into context with other countries of the world, right? So, you know, for white Americans, there's still more police violence against all groups relative to many other democratic countries, right? That the police are engaged in violence at higher rates across the board than we see in places like the United Kingdom or in Germany or Austria, the Netherlands. But for white Americans, we sit closer to our counterparts in Canada and France and the Netherlands. When we start to talk about communities of color, we start to see huge disparities. So when you look at, you know, that Latino Americans are below the averages across white Americans. And when we look for Black Americans, we are talking about contexts that people live that are, you know, you look at, you know, other countries that we are comparable to when you're thinking about the experiences of Black Americans and their opportunity to be victims of police violence. You're talking about countries that generally we don't hold in high esteem as being democracies, right? That are protecting individual liberties, that have fair and equal justice systems. And I think it's important for us to continue to root this conversations in questions of democracy and liberty, and sort of what the environment is for Black Americans in terms of the threats to their liberties by an authority of the government. And you know, I want to be clear that the police are provided with the opportunity to, by law, use force. And in some cases, it's incredibly important and necessary to use force, that we give the police the power to, in certain circumstances, use force, and in some contexts to use deadly force. And that is something that we, you know, is not always inappropriate. But we do have definitions of situations where that force along a continuum of escalation of force is or is not appropriate. And so what undergirds our conversations around the legitimacy of policing is the situations where that inappropriate force is used. And I do just want to make that notation, because we ask the police to go into situations that are dangerous. We ask them to oftentimes resolve conflicts or disputes where violence may be present. And so it's important to recognize that there may be situations where, in fact, the police engage in the use of force. And our concern is really about the questions of inappropriate use of force. So after the killing of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, followed soon after by George Floyd, we saw a significant public concern, outrage, demonstration, protest, rising of voices against the police as an institution, right? So this is not necessarily a concern just about the police in a community, but rather the police as an institution, with calls to defund the police, with calls to demand racial justice of the police as an institution. A series of multiple polls taken over the summer indicate that on average, 1/3 of Americans support efforts to defund the police, right? So not a majority, but a healthy number of Americans are in support of an idea that prior to this summer was not often talked about, right? Was not often suggested as a reform effort. And so this call for the defunding of the police and this call for the attention to racial justice that followed in much in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement was an important change in the public discussion about what the institution of policing and the justice system should mean in communities. And obviously we're in a situation where we now have to figure out as reformers, what does that mean? So where do we go with those calls? And what are the issues that we must hold in the balance? Efforts to defund the police raise significant questions. One of which is, what does it mean to call for defunding the police? Is this about dismantling institutions of policing? Is this about reinventing them? Is this about cutting their funding? Is this about reforming them? And so when that 31% or so of the American public calls for defunding the police, some more detailed survey work has actually shown that people hold a lot of different ideas about what that call for the defunding of the police means. Not all of which necessarily means disbanding police or dismantling the police, but some of it does, right? And so some of the American public holding that notion of defunding the police really do suggest a notion of finding alternative mechanisms of public safety other than policing, right? And much of that critique of the policing actually goes back to historical roots of policing, questions about whether police really ever can achieve the mission of being equal protectors of safety across all communities when they have historical legacies around slavery, around the enforcement of slavery, around lynchings, around the enforcement of Jim Crow segregation, right? That this history is just too questionably tainted around issues of racial justice, that maybe the whole thing is broken, right? That is certainly something that some of the public holds in their mind and some of the reform efforts are calling for. So in thinking about this, I would like to recognize my colleague, Rod Brunson, who's done some terrific work looking at the complexity of that question. So if we think about this question of not only over-policing, right, excessive use of force, the militarization of police in communities of color, the idea that the police are an over-presence in communities of color. So Rod's work really has suggested, there's equal danger to the police under-policing, right? That is not responding to calls, not keeping people safe, not being there to protect communities that are vulnerable due to structural racism. Rod had a wonderful article over the summer in the Washington Post that actually called our attention to the complexity of that issue for defunding the police, that in fact, there are some places where what we need is more safety for communities, whether that safety is in the form of policing or not, that it's important to recognize that these this concern about over-policing does not mean that communities of color have historically actually benefited from the safety that the police provide, right? That there's still danger, there's still questions about whether or not individuals will be victims of crime and whether or not they'll be protected. So this is a complex question that sort of simple calls for defunding the police don't get at. And there are also these questions about, we've been here before, right? We have been having actually these exact same conversations for a long time, and that they haven't actually progressed as far as we would hope they would. This illustration is a man with a sign that says, "I marched in '68, I'm still marching in 2020," right? This is not anything new. And I call attention to sort of this timeline of our solutions to racial violence by the police, which has been to put together a commission, right? To suggest police reform, which we just did in Massachusetts yesterday again, and I'll talk briefly about that. But these questions about how to reform the police, how to prevent police violence, how to prevent the disproportion of police violence against communities of color are not new, right? That we can go back to 1917, right? So early commissions that were put in place after unrest in Chicago in the 1920s, the Harlem Commission in the 1930s, the Detroit Commission in 1943, right? To sort of more recent commissions, the Kerner Commission, which we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of a few years ago. The Kerner Commission was one of the watershed commissions that was put together by Johnson following the violence in Watson, Newark, and Detroit, and then escalation of police violence following some of the civil disobedience following Martin Luther King's assassination. To the Christopher Commission in the 1990s, following the beating of Rodney King, to the 21st Century Policing Commission in 2015. And what we have in these commissions, I will read you one of my often used lines from the back of the Kerner Commission, the last part of the Kerner Commission. So in 1968, the Kerner Commission released the findings of their work, and they quoted Kenneth Clark, who's a social scientist, who is talking about the work of the commission. And he says, "I read the report of the 1918 riots, and as if I were reading the report of the Committee on the Harlem Riots of '35, and the report of the Investigating Committee on the Harlem Riots, or the report of the McCone Commission. And I must say again in candor, it's kind of an Alice in Wonderland with the same moving picture reshown over and over again, the same analysis, the same recommendations, and the same inaction," right? So if we go back and study each of those commission reports, they often say very much the same thing. Sometimes in different language, different terminologies used. Maybe the terminology becomes more progressive. We've moved the needle slightly, but they are basically all saying the same thing. We need more training. We need accountability measures. We need to diversify police departments. We need to have community engagement. And so it's not like we don't know what those solutions should be. We haven't had a century of reports suggesting the recipe for building a better mousetrap. And the question is, why haven't we? What has not worked? We have made many of those changes. And so why are the outcomes not necessarily changing? Why are we again in 2020 having probably one of the points in time in which we have the most racial division in terms of trust and confidence in the police? And I would suggest a few things. So I'll come to this really quickly because it's our most recent commission, right? We haven't gotten a commission report, but it is the enactment of the commission. In Massachusetts, yesterday, the House and Senate came to an agreement on a compromise bill for state police reform, which, not surprisingly, establishes a new commission on police certification and creates a number of specific commissions. I think there were 8 or 9 of them: a committee on racism and corrections, a commission on civil reform. It it doesn't make too many significant changes, particularly around qualified immunity. It does ban racial profiling, something that I think has been banned legislatively in Massachusetts for a long time and certainly is unconstitutional. It creates a more direct chokehold ban. It does add some requirements for standardized training through the Massachusetts Training Council. But we're kind of back to exactly the same recommendations we see in many of these. I mean, those recommendations could have come directly out of the 21st Century Policing Report. And one would argue, why haven't they, right? Those are not things we haven't known for a long time have the potential to be effective at changing police institutions. One of the tools that I think has been actually, is interesting to talk about when we think about police reform is about this notion of accountability, right? So we can say the police should adopt new policies, new procedures, there should be training, there should be diversification, there should be accountability. And so the question is, who holds agencies accountable for those reforms? And for a long time, there were no mechanisms to hold agencies accountable for civil rights violations outside of an individual bringing a claim of civil action, a 1983 claim against a police department for violation of their own civil rights. And one of, I think, the places that we lose oftentimes in the debate about the 1994 crime bill has risen again with Biden's election. And we know that there's many problematic aspects of and complexities to the 1994 crime bill, but something that's oftentimes lost in that bill is that following the Christopher Commission, and particularly following the situation where the 4 police officers were acquitted of Rodney King's beatings, that the federal government passed as part of that very complex crime bill a provision called Section 14141, which is a section that allows for pattern and practice investigations into police departments by the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. It empowers the U.S. Attorney General to bring claims against police agencies or justice system agencies for the violations of individual civil rights. And this was really a tremendous change, right? Because it shifted the burden. Previously, individuals had to have standing to bring claims against police departments. They had to have been a victim of a civil rights violation. And they would have to go get an attorney and bring a claim, a tort claim against a police department, most of which they lost, in part because of the sort of legal standards around animus that developed in those 1983 claims, but also in part because, if you think about individuals who are oftentimes targets of police abuse or violations of civil liberties, they're not necessarily going to have easy access to attorneys and to have resources to bring a legal suit against a police department. So the 1983 claims, were really unsuccessful at moving the needle on police reform. And so this Section 14141 gave, the power of the Attorney General, as designated to the Civil Rights Division, the power to investigate claims of civil rights violations by justice agencies. And they sort of honed their attention at law enforcement. And what we saw were the adoption of consent decrees and memorandums of understanding that emerged. If we look at the figure on the left, what we saw were, we've seen sort of rises and falls of the Civil Rights Division taking seriously their duties under 14141. And so we actually see an increase of those cases under the Clinton administration, with the outcome of most of those investigations being memorandums of agreement, which again may be less legally binding, where suggested reforms. You would have a monitor that would oversee those police departments. And what we saw under Obama, we saw a dip under under Bush. We saw those resurgence of 14141 investigations under Obama. And in fact, a resurgence that under Eric Holder's attorney generalship resulted in many more legally binding consent decrees. So decrees that held the accountability of police departments to undertake those reforms and had very, very strict monitoring of that process. We saw the gutting of the Civil Rights Division under the Trump administration, and virtually no pattern and practice investigations opened. Lots of them closed from the Obama administration. And so the tool of the consent decree, is one that is potentially powerful, but also potentially limited, which is that, if we think about the agencies that have had consent decrees, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, Seattle, major police departments, those agencies have clearly made change. There has been clear reform. But we wouldn't say the problems have gone away, right? That there's not questions of police violence. There's not questions of racial disparities in outcomes of the justice system in those places, right? But there has been significant institutional change in those agencies. And what I think, though, that pattern and practice did, there's a handful, as you can see on the map on the right, of places where there have been consent decrees, right? So, 20, 30 of them. But what they did is they scared other agencies to say, we do not want to be in a situation of having consent decree, so we will get our shop in order. We will create accountability measures. We will do the things that are recommended by all these commissions in order to protect ourselves from the liability of consent decrees. And so they had a much more widespread impact in terms of creating accountability to avoid those situations where one could be held accountable under a consent decree. That being said, even in places where we've seen significant, and I think police scholars would say there has been significant institutional change around accountability mechanisms within law enforcement in the last 20 years, certainly since the passage of the 1994 bill. Yet, the outcomes that we see arguably are problematic still, right? They're arguably, some would say, no different. Right? So despite the fact that we have changed these difficult to change institutions in terms of the structures that create accountability that are intended to prevent police violence, inappropriate uses of force, we still see that happening, right? And we don't necessarily see widespread reductions in use of force. And so the question is, why? And are we in the wrong place? Are we having the wrong conversation? Why does changing institutional structure not seem to necessarily change practice, or not to change practice long-term, right? Not to hold, not to become institutionalized. And I think the conversation that has really emerged since the death of George Floyd is this question about culture, right? That in fact, that changing police structures, that changing the accountability mechanisms within, the building a better mousetrap within police agencies isn't going to do much if we live in a society that is racialized and racially biased. I've interviewed lots of police officers over my career. And I would say that police officers and detectives and supervisors and police leaders don't want to do something that the public doesn't want them to do generally, right? They generally, in fact, oftentimes choose their priorities based on their perceptions of what they think the public wants them to do. And so we must reevaluate, what does the public want the police to do? And are the police doing it? And is that a problem, right? And so is the problem society, right? Is the problem actually that it's hard to, we can change that institution, but it's hard to make it function in ways that don't result in racial disparities if we live in a society completely animated by race, and that for which racial inequality, is something that exists in all other institutions of our society. The former police commissioner of the Boston Police Department, Ed Davis, once said, I do not get my police officers from Mars, right? They come from the community. They come with every baggage of all of our communities. And so it is up to us in many ways to think about how we change our communities and how we change what we're asking the police to do, right? So we hold the police to a higher standard And that's maybe important. They can use coercive social control. They are carrying firearms. They are allowed to deprive people of liberties. But is it fair to hold the police to a standard that we don't hold ourselves to, that we don't hold other institutions of our society to, that we allow racial animus to exist freely in society, but we want the police outcomes to be different than that? And I think those are hard questions for criminal justice scholars, because that means the places that we need to look for solutions may exist outside of the criminal justice system, right? Or may exist within the justice system and within this broader perspective. And so what's different about the conversation now? The thing that I see that's different about the conversation now is, if I think back, to the conversation around, Trayvon Martin, do you think back to the conversation around the 21st Century Police Commission? You think back to those conversations for which the changes recommended were really centered on the justice system. They were centered on, there was very little, reflection of society in general. The conversation I think we have opportunities here is when I hear my friends and neighbors talking about the things that are happening in their jobs that have nothing to do with criminal justice, that are absolutely, engaged in questions of anti-racism, that are, when people in the community more broadly are having questions that they're raising to each other around race. When we start to see this move into all other institutions, not just be housed in the justice system, because the solution to this problem, again, may not be found within the justice system itself, may not be found within criminal justice reform alone. And so I think we have more common ground than we might think, right? That we may be in a place that is, in fact, different than we have seen in the past. As I started off in this conversation, an overwhelming majority of people disapprove of harsh justice penalties like mandatory minimums. That's a very, very different place than we were in the 1990s. We have almost, some agreement between Republicans and Democrats about the fact that racial violence occurs by the police. We have voters within Massachusetts who say the current system of incarcerating people is counterproductive and that we incarcerate too many residents, right? So there are places in this moment of criminal justice reform where there is agreement that we haven't had in a long time about the necessity to look at the system, the necessity to make change. And I think that opportunity is something that we can harness. It will not last long. And this sort of ties in with the second part of what I want to talk about tonight, which is how it relates to COVID. And it will not, it will be threatened to go away when we start to see the impacts of our country recovering from COVID. Which is going to result in, which has resulted in widespread job loss, which is economic challenges, which may lead to communities becoming less safe, and for which we may lose this moment of reform. So I'm going to talk a little bit at the end of this talk about what I've been thinking about in terms of what this means for the study and teaching about criminal justice, because I think that there are some important lessons that we can take away from this moment when we think about where we go as a field, where we go as a school educating young people about the justice system, and where we are in public scholarship and dialogue. I do want to talk for a couple of minutes about I think what is creating right now a public health crisis, but will, in not too long of a future, have significant potential implications in terms of a justice system crisis as well. And that is the challenges of the COVID pandemic. We have seen direct impacts of COVID when we just look at the justice system and the ability of the justice system to function under a situation of a pandemic, right? So we know one of the places where there is the most significant risk of outbreak is in prisons and jails, right? So the number of prisoners infected with COVID had risen dramatically. By mid-November, we had nearly 200,000 people in US prisons and jails who tested positive for COVID. And what that has resulted in, so that has health consequences for individuals who face enhanced risk of infection because of being in a prison or jail, but it has also dramatically changed the conditions in which they live. Most prisons are in 23-hour-a-day lockup now, right? So prisoners aren't interacting with each other. That has huge constitutional right issues, right? That what that means for a person's conditions of confinement, are very dramatic. There are limited visitors into prison, right? So what we're talking about is a group of people who are incarcerated, millions of people who are incarcerated, who are going to go through some period of time of their incarceration, which is potentially quite damaging to them as people, right? And that they're likely going to return to society at some point in time and have those impacts of what it was like to be incarcerated during the time of a pandemic. We have other areas of the justice system that have suffered significantly because of COVID, exposure of first responders, right? So first responders getting sick, being called out, facing dangers around the pandemic. We have, concerns around due process. We have had significant disruption of courts. And what this has resulted in is, in Massachusetts alone, we've had over 1,800 trials that have been postponed. Right, so people's ability to have their day in court, to see justice, to move forward when incarcerated in a jail, and have their case heard, have been curtailed. And we have had significant disruption of treatment for individuals who have substance use disorder, which we have not even begun to see the impact of, and will face the impact of for likely years or potential decades to come, in terms of how the inability to treat individuals for opioids and other substance uses may impact long-term community safety. We have seen, when we look at data, that we have had somewhat confusing situation on crime. We saw in Boston that crimes known to the police, which you'll see in the graph on the right, dropped dramatically. The line is in March is the stay-at-home order. But then went back up, right? So by the time we got into the summer, crime was going back up. We were starting to see increases in crime. We've seen certain areas where we've had a lot of increases in crime. So intimate partner violence rates have increased. People who have suffered from family violence have had less ability to seek shelter, have had less ability to get assistance. So when we look just at Boston and domestic violence incidents reported to the police, again, we see that sharp decrease and then actually a quite sharp increase, right? So we're at levels that are near, or in some cases above, where we were before the pandemic. And we think these are vastly underreported levels too, right? Which makes us increasingly concerned, because people are oftentimes not seeking help, not calling the police, not going to victim services, not heading out to a shelter because of concerns about the virus. So we're going to see probably long-term impacts of this. In the work that I do, the majority of my work is looking at exploitation of individuals, so commercial sexual exploitation and labor trafficking. We see huge amounts of vulnerability. And we see some shifts around the ways in which people have been vulnerable. There is increased risk of abuse of young people who may be victims of commercial sexual exploitation because they're increasingly running away from homes. So we're seeing increased homelessness of youth who have been trapped in their families during the pandemic, and for a lot of different reasons need to get out of that situation. As there's increasing intimate partner and family violence, there is more likely the chance that more youth are running away from home, which is a very large risk factor for exploitation. And there's increased financial stress in families, which is resulting in the chances of individuals becoming abused and vulnerable increasing. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has reported a doubling of online sexual exploitation between March and April of 2020 and the previous year before, right? So what we see interesting in commercial sexual exploitation of children is that there was less opportunity for people to be necessarily out on the street, but this huge increase in the victimization of young people by putting pictures of them or videos of them online, selling that, making that available to people, utilizing the internet for commercial sexual exploitation. And that creates significant challenges for investigation, disruption, identification of those individuals who are no longer in the public eye, who may not be on the street, who are not be coming into contact with people who are purchasing financing commercial sex, that in fact driving victimization underground further, and making places like the dark web and other internet-based methods of exploitation increasingly likely to occur. And then that has significant consequences for victims that we have not even necessarily begun to see. We also see that the mechanisms by which we identify people as victims of crime, particularly commercial sexual exploitation, have decreased, right? So kids aren't in school. School is one of the huge mechanisms that we identify child abuse. School is one of the primary places that we identify child abuse, and kids aren't in school, right? And so the people that would be watching young people in after-school programs, in community-based programs, and in school are not seeing those kids, and are not seeing the situations that would raise flags around child abuse. And in the case of commercial sexual exploitation, we see that happening. We see a big shift in where referrals are coming from. So drop off of referrals from school and increase in referrals from the police. But the police are more engaged in identifying commercial sexual exploitation of kids relative to other providers, which, you know, may be good, but in other cases, police maybe aren't always the best trusting group for children to disclose abuse to, right? That they're more likely to disclose abuse to people that they've developed relationships with through schools or community engagements. More of the youth that we're finding referred through a 51A child abuse referral in Massachusetts for commercial sexual exploitation have in-home placements, right? So they're not actually in a congregate care facility. They're at an in-home placement, which actually may make them more vulnerable to abuse. And you know, we will see significant intervention disruptions due to funding cuts, and we've seen those disruptions in terms to questions of exposure to the virus. For labor trafficking, we see the same thing, right? So people are, in many cases, desperate for work. We have a whole segment of our community that are essential workers that are being pushed into working conditions that may have been exploitive before and are maybe highly exploitive now under conditions of a pandemic. We have seen a dramatic drop-off of regulation, labor regulators, inspectional services, people that would identify labor violations. And we see widening disparities in working conditions and vulnerability in communities of color, right? These either sexual exploitation or labor exploitation will likely fall more disproportionately on those communities that have been most impacted directly health-wise, financially, structurally by the violence, by the virus. And the economic fallout of the pandemic really exacerbates what we think may be coming down in the future in terms of labor abuses and labor trafficking. So with all of that bad news, what are our opportunities? How do we become thoughtful about reform? How do we tackle these problems? And I think there's a few different opportunities for us. So I'll talk about three places that I think the justice system, we really have an opportunity to do things differently. One is that I think the crisis around legitimacy of the justice system in terms of issues of police violence has made our understanding of the challenges of institutional change even greater, and that there are opportunities for scholars that study institutions, particularly institutions like the police, to inform our conversations about the limitations of institutional change, and to think creatively about ways in which institutional change actually results in changes in action, and how it works with culture. I think there are also opportunities to widen our focus and think about solutions that lie outside of the justice system. I think it's imperative for criminal justice scholars, for educators, to be thinking about the ways in which justice system problems may be solved by parts of our society outside of the justice system that maybe need to work hand in hand with the justice system, or that may need to change in order for the justice system to in fact be more just. And I also think that it's an opportunity for us as educators to look at the ways in which we have in some ways failed to hold justice systems accountable, and have missed opportunities to educate our students about race and the justice system, and create an anti-racist workforce going into the justice system. I mean, we have the opportunity to talk to, engage with, open up conversations about racial justice. And we too rarely do that in our curriculums, in our discussions, and in our scholarship. And that needs to change. And there are significant opportunities for that to change. And in terms of our opportunities for the future in a post-pandemic world, I think COVID has created a number of disruptions that we never thought were possible before, right? We've seen lots of de-incarceration because people, because we can't hold people in jails like we did, because it's actually dangerous. We've started letting people out of prison. Maybe we didn't actually need to keep them there in the first place. From simple things to, did we actually need to take our shoes off at the airport? We stopped doing that in COVID, right? There are questions about COVID had made us do things differently that we said for a long time we could never do differently. And the question is, might we be able to do them differently? Might we be able to make reforms we didn't think were possible because COVID has forced us to do things differently? Can we have trials online? Could we talk to victim service providers using telehealth? Are there opportunities for us to remake victim services, to remake outreach and engagement in terms of what public safety might mean that we've learned through this pandemic? So I think there are in fact opportunities there. And I think that there is a requirement that we recognize that the impacts of COVID are disproportionately impacting Black and Brown communities. They widen wealth gaps. They create they exacerbate structural disparities, and that this may have significant impacts on public safety in the long run that we have to be able to be cautious about, right? Are we going to just return to where we were 20 or 30 years ago in terms of our thoughts about mandatory minimums, harsh penalties, and incarceration in situations where we start to see impacts of the economic fallout of the pandemic? And those are things that I think we have to be attentive to, because those happen in ways that people don't even recognize them happening, right? So it's important for us as scholars, advocates, researchers, public members, teachers, to pay attention to those disparities and to think about responding differently and creating safety and thinking about what safety means in the community, and not necessarily thinking about draconian justice system measures as the first line of defense when our communities seem unsafe. And I'll end there so we can have some conversation. Sorry, Ted, I know I talked long.
Well, this is terrific. I mean, you've opened a cornucopia of issues for us to deal with. I want to remind everyone that we expect that this is a dialogue, and if you have questions or comments, please type them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can in tonight's session. So please go to the Q&A box and give us some feedback on some of what Amy has just said. I want to start with a question that takes off from where you concluded, that is to say, there are opportunities that we face. Let's say you were called upon by the Biden administration in Washington and asked to put together a task force that could develop some recommendations that would last and could actually be implemented, unlike the recommendations that came out of the Kerner and previous reports. What are the kinds of people you would want to have on that task force? And what's the agenda that you would lay out for them in terms of the kinds of recommendations that they ought to make?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would go back to what I said, which is that, I think we actually have, we actually have a lot of great evaluation research showing the efficacy of police accountability measures, right? That they in fact can work. They in fact oftentimes, when institutionalized, can be effective. And so the bigger question is, why don't we do them? Why don't they last? Why don't they stick in communities? Why aren't they what communities demand? they may be what some communities demand, but why aren't they what the majority of a community that holds the police accountable? So again, I would suggest that, you know, while we're criminal justice scholars, and so the place that we make solution is with it, or we make reform is within the justice system, I would really encourage any administration to think about justice reform much, much more broadly than the justice system alone, right? That the reforms that need to happen are in schools, are in healthcare facilities, are in corporate entities, are amongst those things that we as a public want the police to do, right? And so I think there is actually a part of reimagining what public safety can look like, that if you gave the public an idea of alternative mechanisms of public safety, they might be in favor of it, right? That maybe we need more work looking at what true alternative mechanisms to public safety would be.
And
Right?
who would present that kind of idea? Now, where does that idea come from?
In terms of who would present it?
Yeah. I mean, who assumes leadership in that? And I'm thinking specifically that mandatory minimum sentences didn't always exist.
Yeah.
But someone thought that if you had mandatory minimum sentences, you would get dangerous people off the street. That would reduce crime. And that would be good for society. It would reflect what society was asking for. And in some respects, crime rates did go down.
Yeah.
And so the people who said, well, let's go to mandatory minimums could say, well, you see, we were right. Well, now we think differently about that.
Yeah, and mandatory minimums are complex. The sentencing guidelines and mandatory minimums were actually born out of compromises between liberal and conservative politicians who, on the left, you know, were really concerned about racial inequalities that the systems without guidelines would result in, and on the right were concerned about accountability and punishment, right? And together they came up with this plan for sentencing guidelines and mandatory minimum that had these consequences to it, right? And so I think it is the responsibility of mayors, it is the responsibility of governors, it is the responsibility of elected officials within who have the broad, right, responsibility to keep the community that they govern safe, right? And they oftentimes allocate the responsibility for that safety to one body, to the police. But the question is it broader than that? Should it be broader than that? Should there be other agencies within a city that work collaboratively with the police, that have other responsibilities towards public safety? Can we think about public safety in communities differently? And so I would say it is those elected officials that are broadly responsible for the safety and welfare of the community that they serve.
What would you imagine the connections might be, and how might they be built among social service agencies, police agencies, educational agencies, health agencies? How would that come into being? And how would that in fact manifest what many people have called for in terms of defunding the police,
Yeah.
but increasing the funding for other kinds of services?
Yeah, I think this is an overly simplistic example that I'm going to give, so recognize that when I say it. But in some ways, there are some innovative responses to the opioid crisis that I think actually are providing examples, right? Where we have said that the solution to a problem is not solely a criminal justice solution. The solution to a problem of substance abuse is not just to lock people up. But it doesn't mean there's no role of the police, right? The police still have a role in targeting traffickers of opioids, of disrupting networks of opioid trafficking. But what should we be doing that's actually a public health response, right? And so we have seen these significant partnerships between the police and public health and substance abuse clinics, doctors, social workers in addressing opioids, right? That it's again, there are maybe an overly simplistic example, but there are ways in which we do create partnerships. I think my concern is that when every social problem, when social problems are crime problems, and the solution is police to jump in and solve that through arrest or through shows of force, that there may be many other ways to solve those problems that exist in communities that don't result in people losing their liberty, or that don't result in people feeling threatened by the police.
A reminder that we welcome your questions, and we are getting some. I'll get to those in a moment, but I need to say in reference to the comment that you just made that I oversaw for several years a program in Boston called the Safe Neighborhoods Program. And it came into being at that point in time when the city had set a record for the total number of murders in the city. And we realized that the police department alone could not solve that problem. And so we did, in fact, create a network of agencies and connections that involve schools and the police department and social service agencies and religious organizations, health organizations, local real estate people, local parents groups. And over a 2-year period, we were able to cut the murder rate in the city by 80%. And we went through a period of 2 years where there wasn't a single young person in the city who ended up being murdered. So we had metrics that proved that working together worked. But one of the challenges we faced throughout that period was that when you have agencies that are working together in that way, you get a good outcome, but no one single agency can claim the credit for it. And so the kind of acknowledgement of the work that gets done gets distributed. How do you give credit to the communities, the agencies and the like that have worked together to contribute to that kind of outcome?
Yeah, it's an excellent example. And there has been some terrific evaluation research on Project Safe Neighborhood and for other initiatives like it. And this idea of who is given the credit, who's responsible for it, is wrapped up in something that scholars have talked about as being a challenge of what we call temporary organizations, right? Which is that the group that came together that forms the task force or the multidisciplinary team or you have representatives from all these different agencies kind of working together. They are at their heart only a temporary organization, right? They are maybe they could become permanent, right? And that they should get credit for it as a standing group, right? But in fact, their home organizations are much more powerful and long-lasting and institutionalized than the temporary organization. And so those home institutions fight over it. They sometimes undermine it. They try to pull their people back from it. They have turf wars over it. Because of the strength of those home institutions, it becomes very hard for that temporary institution to stay successful and survive over time. And we see that in all manner of multidisciplinary teams, task forces, joint efforts that show promising success, but are hard to last. And I think this brings us back to where I think scholars who look at institutions and institutionalization can be really helpful.
We have a very interesting question from an individual who identifies himself as being almost 75 and having seen substantial change in the importance of race and ethnicity in general versus wealth and political beliefs. And his question is there evidence that poor whites are treated differently by the police than poor blacks? Or is there just a lack of data on those kinds of differentials?
Yeah, there is actually really, I mean, this is a great question, right? So this question is, is the racial impact that we see across decades of studies, lots and lots of major collections of data, actually just an economic impact? Is it, and the answer to that question is no, right? That we actually, there's some really good meta-analysis that have recently come out that have actually taken this question on to talk about the ways in which, yes, that poorer white Americans are treated worse than white Americans with more wealth, for sure. But that race continues to animate that treatment across time, across space, and across place in ways that wealth does not explain. Right, so that there are important questions about economic structural disadvantage that we should not ignore, but that race is layered on top of that to create significant additional disadvantages that we see impacting people's safety.
The murders of poor African Americans in particular over the last couple of years reflect long patterns that have existed. They haven't just suddenly come into view. Why do you think there's a different response now than there was in the past?
I mean, in some ways, we would hope that our country has grown in terms of our understanding, recognition of race. I mean, that we are definitely in a different place today than we were in the 1960s, than we were in the 1920s, than we were in the 1880s. So there is a piece of this that it is about the fact that, despite the fact that I think the most recent elections have made those of us that thought we were in a very different place rethink that place that we're in. I mean, I think that the 2016 election and the 2020 election continued to be wake-up calls to liberals, to others who really believed we were in a different place around race in this country. And maybe we are not there everywhere. We're clearly not. We're clearly far away from that. And we've seen, so my colleague Kevin Draculich's work looking at elections and race and crime has shown that the racialization of crime has been a driving factor in motivating elections in 2016 in ways that it hasn't for decades, right? So we were back to places that we thought we would not return to in terms of the ways that race motivated and activated race and crime, the intersection, the public, the identification of race and crime motivated voting. So, I do think we are in a different place in many ways, and we have a long ways to go.
Your comments about the importance of culture and the need to change culture opens a very large set of questions. And one of the questions that's come in is around the disconnect that may exist between people who make policy at a high level and what actually happens in terms of the culture that's on the street. And I'll read the question out in its entirety. While the criminal justice system may only be a part of a greater social issue, that being racism and discrimination within our society, policies created to curtail abuse of power by police seem to be in conflict between the culture of street-level professionals and policy implementation. So the question wants to know whether there are appropriate steps or actions that local government, police departments, and community organizations could take in order to better implement the policies and change police and community behaviors.
Right. That's an incredibly important question, and exactly what I was getting at, which is that we can build all the better mousetraps we want in terms of thinking about what the accountability systems might be, or the mission statement, or the programs within policing, and police leaders may advocate a cultural view even at one level that is not represented by frontline officers, that's not represented by frontline supervisors, that you may have field officers going out and saying, you learned all this in the academy and now I'm going to teach you what real policing is about, right? There's decades of research within criminology that is very, very informative about the role of culture, right? That the policing culture, the culture of police officers, the culture within policing, maybe the culture that people bring to policing, which made them decide to want to be police officers, is the place that actually drives what the police do. The policies and the mission statement of the department are not as strong as those cultural values, or those shared cultural values.
What kind of research has been done on who decides to become a police officer?
Yeah, that's a great area, right? So there's not as much as there should be about like what motivates people who decides to become police officers. I mean, we do know that we know from years of research on the challenges of the diversification of policing that that people tend to become interested in policing who come from perspectives where either they sort of believe that they can make change, that they want to improve communities, or that they are, interested in some of the militarization pieces. I mean, that's actually something we've seen change a lot. Some of that's related to military preference within policing, right? So we have increasingly had police departments that we had military preference for. So people that have military backgrounds are going into policing. People that are interested in doing things that look military are going into policing. I mean, we saw a huge shift in policing in terms of the promotion of the ideal of what a police officer is. So my colleague Jack McDevitt and I did research for years looking at programs to promote accountability in policing, and it looked at programs that departments were doing, sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, that were serving in the spirit of service, like trying to attract people who are interested in policing to serve in the spirit of service, trying to get more women, people of color into policing. And those are buttressed by the efforts of police in combat gear, riot training, school shooting training, terrorism, everything that happened after 9/11, the introduction of military grade weapons into policing, right? So that attracts a whole different group of people that are not necessarily serving in the spirit of service. And so this question of who police even are is one I think we have to wrestle with. What does it mean to police a community? I think there's that question. And then there's the bigger question of who should be responsible for public safety, or how do we do public safety? And what is the role of the police in that process, right? So, but this question of what the police are, how the public sees the police, there will be impacts of this summer's, unrest and concerns around policing and the longstanding calls for reform that will impact the hiring of police officers.
You've raised a number of questions about the accountability of police, both institutionally and as individuals. One of the questions that has come in raises the question of accountability in an even larger sense, and that is where you have countries where there is international criminal activity going back and forth. In those kinds of transnational criminal settings, how does one go about ensuring judicial justice without prejudice?
Yeah, so maybe I can try to unpack that question a little bit. So these questions, and I will say at the outset that I do not do as much work on international criminal justice issues. My work, even on trafficking, is very much focused on the United States. So that being said, I can speak to the perspective of the United States, which is this: what I see as being a bigger issue is the perceptions of individuals who may come from all different countries around the world, who have different forms of policing, and then are in the United States and interact with our justice systems and have expectations about what those justice systems will look like, and may have fears about what those justice systems will look like. And so this questions about what is acceptable in the United States versus what is acceptable in another country, or maybe what is lawful in another country and unlawful here in terms of the engagement of police in communities, are important questions. I see them as less important when we are investigating internationally related crime. I mean, we're focused on police focus on the criminal activity that did happen in the United States. Those are the places where we've had very few criminal laws that allow us to look at criminal activity happening outside of boundaries of the United States. We do have some mechanisms that allow us to look at transnational crime that occurs elsewhere and here. But the protections of our Constitution, will apply to all crimes that are happening here. So, I think perpetrators and victims may have different expectations about what the justice system may look like that make those crimes more complicated to solve or to address. But that I don't necessarily see it as changing what justice systems should do here.
One of our participants notes that in business, it's a truism that you get what you pay for. And also what you can measure. And so the question they've raised is, have any societies tried providing financial incentives to the police and other governmental administrative groups that are tied to measures of civil safety
That's a
as
good
you
question.
see it?
Yeah, I don't actually know. I would say that one of the things that we have seen in the United States is that there's a significant decrease in corruption within law enforcement, right? So particularly relative to other parts of the world. And this is one of the places where my human trafficking work oftentimes intersects with other scholars studying policing around human trafficking in different cultural contexts. We do not see the level of corruption within policing that we see in many other parts of the world. Or that we saw in the United States in earlier parts of our history, in part because we pay the police fairly well. we pay police quite well in this country, and in base salary, in opportunities for overtime. And so we see less corruption. We see more accountability around corruption, but we also see less corruption in part because police officers are paid quite well and regularly in the United States. And I think that that's important to look at those payment levels, how we actually compensate law enforcement compared to other places in the world where police are paid very little and there's significant corruption.
I'd like your comments on a series of questions that have come in. One is about the role of guns in shaping or reshaping police culture. And a second goes to the question of what the role of the police may be in dealing with Black on Black crime, given that many, in fact, as far as I know, the majority of young African Americans who have been killed by police, have been killed primarily in communities of color.
Mm-hmm. Right. So in terms of the second question, these questions are they're related to each other. But in terms of the second question, I mean, there are questions about. I think this brings us back to this question about my colleague Rod Brunson's fantastic work on underpolicing and these questions about trust in the police in communities of color. And so the question becomes, if you do have interracial violence. You have communities where people are being victimized by other people that share their racial group, their racial characteristics. It still is are the police the right solution to some of those problems? Are the police the mechanism in communities of color to best keep other members of the community who are communities of members of color safe? Right? And maybe not, right? And maybe there are places in which we, in fact, could do a much better job keeping people safe in their communities through other mechanisms, right? It doesn't really appear that I guess to your point about mandatory minimums, right? There have been reductions in crime over time. There are huge debates in the field about the relationship of that crime decrease to mandatory minimums, right? And so I'm not yet at the place where I'm convinced by the evidence that mandatory minimums alone or harsh sentencing policies alone were responsible for crime decreases. There are many other factors that social scientists have identified. In terms of protections around guns, I mean, Boston's a very good example. Boston is almost singularly focused on getting guns off the street, on keeping guns out of communities. But what we don't track and what we don't keep accountability measures on, the Boston Police Department, there's a sort of a news release every time a gun is found, and there's a tweet about each new gun taken off the street. But how many times are they, in fact, rolling up on kids, talking to people, searching them, detaining them, where we don't find guns, where we don't keep people safe, where we aren't effective? And so the question is, what exactly are we measuring? What's the outcome that we're measuring? I mean, it is clear that violent crime is down. And it is clear that it's important for us as criminologists to understand the causes of those crime decreases. There are many other ways we could control gun crime, one of which would be through gun legislation, right? And one would be through just making guns much, much less available. And we would then not need the police necessarily to go take all those guns off the street, right? That is, I think, an important conversation we continue to keep having and continue to have very little traction on.
And there are clear correlations between the availability of guns and crime rates, particularly
Absolutely.
crime rates involving the use of weapons.
Exactly.
It seems almost incredulous to me that we're not using those correlations to set policy.
Yep.
I should note one other thing that I learned rather to my surprise in Boston when I first moved here, and that is that for many years, for decades, in a number of our communities, there were multiple justice systems that existed, particularly for young people in particular communities. So, for example, in the Jewish community that existed in Mattapan, in the Chinese community that existed in Chinatown, and in the Irish community that existed in Charlestown, very often young people who might run afoul of the law were referred not into the judicial system, but into local systems where the community itself meted out a sense of justice, and the person never ended up being a statistic, and certainly never ended up being incarcerated by the larger criminal justice system. Those separate systems have since largely disappeared. But it is clear that in a great many communities, not just in Boston, but elsewhere, where individuals are referred back into the community's own judicial systems, their own non-statewide systems, justice has been meted out. I have a question about justice, because we're talking about criminal justice. What would that look like to you? How would you know that we were there? What are the metrics one uses in order to assess whether one is actually achieving a sense of justice in a community?
Yeah. I mean, I think that these go back to big questions, right? You can go back to Rawls, you can go back to Plato, you can go back to our fundamental notions of what justice should look like, right? And, you know, if we go back to this notion of, in many ways, that justice is about a sense of a shared sense of safety by a large group of the population. That you know, if you think back to Rawls, right, our notion of that the least fortunate amongst us is equally taken care of as the wealthiest amongst us. This sort of, you know, the veil of ignorance. This idea that it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter your wealth, your immutable characteristics, where you live. There is a sense of shared safety, that we are allowed to have liberty, that we are allowed to engage in, you know, going back to Plato, to be our best selves, that we are allowed to have passions, that we are allowed to be full humans in a place that takes care of our safety to allow us to do those things, right? And that protects that safety equally among society, so that all members of society can realize their best potential as humans. And I think that's why I continue to bring these back to core democratic notions, right? That this notion of democratic policing that sort of emerged out of the community policing and procedural justice movement, you know, to not lose that notion of democracy that undergirds our questions about democratic policing. They're fundamental. They're a question about who we are as people, right? Who we are as a collective, who we are as a society. And I think the place that we're at in many ways is to question that very notion. And maybe that's an important question, because maybe it brings us back to rethinking, you know, forms of justice like restorative justice, that forms of justice that make us more whole as people.
Well, I think that that's a great observation for us to close out on. I'll note that one of the participants made the comment that racism is one issue, and criminal justice raises a somewhat separate set of issues. The two are obviously entwined, but it may be that we're not going to achieve justice for all until we look at the core issues in the criminal justice system somewhat separately from those of race, and that we deal with some of the base criminal justice issues that cover not just people of color, but all of the people who are treated disparately in our criminal justice system. And I think that gives us more to think about. The issues have been raised in the context of race, and they will continue to exist, unfortunately, in the context of race. But the work that you and your colleagues have been doing, I think, covers a very wide range of Americans and a very wide range of ethical, social, and cultural issues. So, Amy Farrell, thank you. We're grateful that you have made the time this evening to talk about some of your views on criminal justice and where the studies are going. I remind everyone that next week, our last session, we're going to be focusing on culture and on the role of large institutions in bringing people together, and looking forward to the kinds of things that our cultural institutions can do to bring people together in this post-COVID period. So I hope that everyone had a safe and thankful Thanksgiving. My thanks again to Amy and to Jean, our staff person. And I look forward to seeing folks again next week. Thank you.